The moment Tristan Mercer stepped into the dimly lit jazz club, the smoky air and sultry melody of a slow saxophone wrapped around him like a secret. He hadn't planned to be here tonight, just another unassuming Tuesday, another evening where the weight of his multi-million-dollar empire pressed down on him. But something about this place, tucked away in a quiet New York alley, had drawn him in. Then she walked onto the stage. Ava Carter. She didn't announce her name, she didn't need to. From the second she grasped the microphone, the room belonged to her. She was in a deep blue dress, simple, elegant, hugging her curves just enough to make it impossible not to look. But it wasn't the dress that held Tristan captive. It was her voice. Smooth. Soulful. Like honey and heartbreak all at once. He leaned back in his chair, watching as she closed her eyes and lost herself in the music. She wasn't just singing, she was feeling every note, every word. The crowd murmured in appreciation, but Tristan stayed silent, utterly transfixed. When she finished, the applause was loud but brief, the kind that came from an audience too lost in the moment to remember to clap. She gave a small, grateful smile before stepping off the stage and weaving through the tables toward the bar. Tristan found himself standing before he even thought about moving. He wasn't the kind of man who chased women. Women came to him at charity galas, at exclusive events, in whispered invitations from across five-star hotel bars. But something about Ava made him forget all of that. He approached the bar, slipping into the seat beside her. The bartender, an older man with a knowing look, poured her a whiskey without her having to ask. "You have the kind of voice that makes people forget to breathe," Tristan said, his voice low, steady. Ava turned her head slightly, her dark brown eyes meeting his. "That's either a poetic compliment or a very dramatic medical concern." He chuckled. "Let's go with the compliment." She studied him, her eyes scanning his sharp jawline, the expensive cut of his suit though he ditched the tie tonight, and the way he held himself. Confident. Collected. Dangerous in the way only a man who was used to getting what he wanted could be. "And you are?" she asked, taking a slow sip of her drink. "Tristan." She raised an eyebrow. "Just Tristan. For now." Ava had met men like him before, smooth, charming, the kind who thought they could win a woman over with a few well-placed words. But something about him felt different. He wasn't looking at her like she was a game to be played. He looked at her like she was a song he couldn't quite figure out, a melody stuck in his head that wouldn't let go. "You come here often?" she asked, tilting her glass slightly. "First time," he admitted. "Something told me I should." Ava laughed softly, shaking her head. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," Tristan said. "But I do know that I'm going to be back. And I hope you'll be singing." She should have rolled her eyes, brushed him off, turned back to her drink. But instead, she found herself smiling. "I sing here every Tuesday and Friday. So if you're planning to be a regular, you'll know where to find me." He lifted his own glass in a silent toast. "Then I'll see you Friday." Ava didn't know why she felt a strange flutter in her stomach as she watched him walk away. She had no idea that the mysterious man who seemed so drawn to her was a millionaire. No idea that this one conversation would change both of their lives forever. Friday arrived, and Tristan found himself standing in the same dimly lit jazz club, surrounded by the hum of quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses. The place had the same smoky warmth as before, the air thick with the scent of aged whiskey and the low murmur of a piano being tuned on stage. He wasn't a man who indulged in rituals, but something about showing up tonight felt inevitable. Ava was already on stage, her fingers wrapped around the microphone stand as she sang a slow, aching ballad. Her voice curled around the lyrics, drawing in every soul in the room, making them feel something they hadn't expected to feel when they walked in. Tristan leaned back in his chair, watching her the way a man watches the ocean, aware that, at any moment, he could be pulled under. When her set ended, she disappeared backstage for a moment before emerging near the bar, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. Tristan followed her, weaving through tables until he reached her side. She hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on the bartender handing her a glass. "I told you I'd be back," he said, his voice just above the hum of jazz filling the space. Ava turned, her expression unreadable for a brief second before a slow, knowing smile curved her lips. "You did. Guess you're a man of your word." He gestured toward the seat beside her. "Mind if I join you?" She tapped the bar lightly, considering something, then nodded. "Suit yourself." Tristan slid onto the stool beside her, signaling for his own drink. Ava studied him, her eyes flickering over the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his movements. "You don't seem like the usual crowd here," she remarked. "Most people come in groups, looking for an escape. You? You seem like you belong in a place with a dress code." Tristan chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Should I take that as an insult?" "It's an observation," she said. You're different. Not a bad thing, just noticeable. He met her gaze, something flickering behind his eyes. And what about you? You don't just sing. You feel the music. Like it's something you need. Ava exhaled, barely shaking her head. That's a little intense for a guy I just met. He leaned in slightly, his tone teasing but firm. Am I wrong? She hesitated, her fingers brushing the rim of her glass. No, she admitted. Music's all I've got, really. Tristan didn't press, but he filed that away. He could tell there was more to her story, something unspoken beneath her words. A man approached just then, his broad frame filling the space beside Ava. Hey, sweetheart, he said smoothly, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. That was some performance. Ava stiffened slightly, the ease in her shoulders vanishing. Thanks, she said, her voice polite but distant. Tristan's gaze darkened as he observed the man, sensing the discomfort in Ava's posture. You should let me take you out sometime, the stranger continued, leaning against the bar. A voice like yours deserves a real stage. I know people. I could make things happen for you. Ava's fingers tightened around her glass. I'm not looking for a manager. I wasn't offering to manage you, the man said, his voice laced with suggestion. Tristan set his glass down with a quiet finality, turning his attention fully to the man. I think she made it clear she's not interested. The stranger turned, sizing Tristan up. And who are you exactly? Tristan's expression remained calm, but there was an undeniable authority in his voice. Someone who listens when a woman says no. A tense beat stretched between them before the man scoffed, muttering something under his breath before pushing off the bar and disappearing into the crowd. Ava released a slow breath, shaking her head. Guys like that always think they're doing you a favor. Tristan studied her for a moment before speaking. You deal with that often? She lifted a shoulder in a half shrug. Comes with the territory. He didn't like the sound of that, but he let it go for now. Instead, he said, You ever thought about singing somewhere bigger? She laughed softly, tilting her head. You mean like those places with a dress code? Maybe, he said, a small smile playing at his lips. I think your voice deserves more than this little club. Ava looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. I like it here. Tristan nodded, respecting her answer. Fair enough. A comfortable silence settled between them, the music from the stage filling the gaps in conversation. After a few moments, Ava set her glass down. So, Tristan, you keep showing up at my performances. What's your deal? He smirked slightly, but there was something genuine in his answer. I like good music. She gave him a look, unconvinced but amused. And, he said, his voice quieter now, I like the way you sing. Ava held his gaze for a long moment before shaking her head with a soft laugh. You're trouble, aren't you? Tristan lifted his drink to his lips, his eyes twinkling. Depends on who you ask. She exhaled, her amusement laced with curiosity. Well, Tristan, I guess I'll be seeing you around. He nodded once, knowing without a doubt that he wasn't done with Ava Carter. Not even close. Tristan had never been the kind of man to linger on someone he barely knew, but Ava Carter had a way of staying with him. Her voice echoed in his mind long after he left the jazz club, threading through his thoughts like a song he couldn't shake. He told himself it was just curiosity, nothing more. And yet, when Friday came again, he was there before her set even started. This time, he didn't take his usual seat at the bar. He found a quiet table in the back, where he could watch without being obvious. He wasn't the only one drawn to her. The club was fuller than usual, and as she stepped onto the stage, heads turned, conversations paused, and the air shifted. Tonight, she wore deep red, the color rich against her skin under the soft glow of the stage lights. She didn't scan the room or search for familiar faces. When she sang for herself. Tristan watched her lose herself in the melody, her voice carrying something raw beneath the surface. Tonight, it wasn't just a performance. There was weight behind every note, as if she was singing through something she couldn't quite say. By the time her set ended, he already knew he wasn't walking away without speaking to her. He waited until she finished thanking the pianist, until she stepped toward the side of the room, away from the crowd pressing in to tell her how incredible she was. You sing differently when something's on your mind, Tristan said as he approached, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Ava turned, her expression unreadable at first, but recognition flickered in her eyes. And you've heard me enough to know when something's different? He didn't answer right away. The truth was, he'd been paying attention to every detail since the first night. But he wasn't about to admit that. Instead, he asked, "You want to talk about it?" Ava exhaled through her nose, shaking her head lightly. "It's nothing." He didn't push, but he also didn't leave. She sighed, rolling her shoulders as if trying to shake something off. "It's just some things don't work out the way you think they will. That's all." Tristan could tell she wasn't the type to unload her problems on a near stranger, but there was something in her voice that made him want to pry. "Things?" he echoed, arching a brow. Ava huffed a quiet laugh. "You don't let things go, do you?" "Not when I think they matter." She studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the bar. "Fine. You want to hear about my terrible day? Get me a drink first." Tristan didn't hesitate. He signaled the bartender, ordering whatever she wanted, then leaned against the counter, waiting. Ava swirled the liquid in her glass before finally speaking. "I had an audition today. Thought it went well. Turns out they had someone else in mind before I even walked in." Tristan frowned. "They made you go through the whole process knowing they weren't going to pick you?" She nodded, taking a slow sip. "Welcome to the business." He didn't like how easily she said it, as if she'd gotten used to disappointment. "Then they don't deserve to have you," he said simply. Ava gave him a look. "That's a nice thought, but unfortunately deserving doesn't pay the bills." Tristan knew that struggle all too well, though it had been years since he'd had to worry about money. He was no stranger to working for something that felt just out of reach. "What if I told you I could get you a better opportunity?" he asked, watching her reaction carefully. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what, exactly, does that mean?" "I know people," he said, not as an empty phrase, but as a fact. "I could make some calls. Get you in a room with the right audience." Her expression shifted, guarded now. "And why would you do that?" "Because you're talented," Tristan said, not missing a beat. "And because I don't like seeing the wrong people win." Ava let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." She looked at him then, something uncertain flickering in her gaze. "I don't take favors from men who expect something in return." Tristan's lips pressed together, his jaw tightening slightly. "That's not what this is." Ava watched him carefully, studying him for any trace of dishonesty. When she found none, she exhaled. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "But I'm used to doing things on my own." He could respect that. But that didn't mean he was going to stop trying. "In case you change your mind," Tristan said, pulling a small card from his wallet and sliding it toward her. "Call me." Ava hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. "Tristan Mercer," she read aloud, then glanced up. "You don't strike me as the business card type." "I'm not," he admitted. "But I figured you'd need proof I'm serious." She slipped the card into her purse, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." Tristan wasn't sure what her answer would be, but he knew one thing: this wasn't the last time he'd see Ava Carter. Not by a long shot. Ava hadn't planned to call. She tucked Tristan's card into her purse the night he'd given it to her, fully intending to forget about it. But somehow, it stayed in her thoughts, like a melody she couldn't shake. His offer had been generous, almost too generous, and she wasn't the type to take handouts even if they came from a man who looked at her like she was the only song worth listening to. Yet, after another week of closed doors and polite rejections, she found herself staring at his number, her fingers hovering over her phone. Before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed. Tristan answered on the second ring, his voice steady and warm. He didn't sound surprised to hear from her. 2 days later, she found herself standing outside a sleek, glass-paneled studio in the heart of Manhattan, feeling wildly out of place. The lobby was polished and modern, filled with people who moved with the confidence of those who belonged. Ava, on the other hand, felt like she was trespassing. Then Tristan appeared. He approached with effortless ease, dressed in a crisp navy jacket over a black shirt, the kind of outfit that looked expensive without trying too hard. His presence commanded attention, but when he reached her, his expression softened. "Glad you called," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not sure if I am yet," she admitted, gripping the strap of her bag. Tristan motioned for her to follow him. "Come inside. Let's find out." She stepped into the studio, her heart pounding. Inside, a producer was waiting, a man with silver hair, who greeted Tristan with familiarity before turning to Ava with an assessing gaze. "You must be the one Mercer's been talking about," he said. Tristan had talked about her? Instead of asking, she nodded. The producer gestured toward the recording booth. Let's hear what you've got. Ava swallowed, feeling suddenly exposed. She hadn't prepared, hadn't planned for this moment to happen so soon. But then she glanced at Tristan, standing just outside the booth, watching her with quiet confidence. So she sang. At first, she kept it controlled, careful, but as the music swelled, she let herself go. She stopped thinking about where she was and who was listening. She just felt. When she finished, the silence in the control room stretched. Then the producer let out a low whistle. You weren't exaggerating, he said to Tristan. She's got something rare. Ava blinked. Wait, you've already heard about me? Tristan met her gaze. I told you I know people. The producer turned back to Ava. How do you feel about performing at a private event next weekend? Small crowd, but the right kind of people. Ava wasn't sure what to say. This was happening too fast, too unexpectedly. Tristan must have sensed her hesitation because he spoke before she could answer. You don't have to decide now. Think about it. She did. For the next 2 days, she thought about nothing else. When she finally agreed, Tristan didn't look surprised. The night of the event, Ava arrived at the venue, a penthouse overlooking the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a skyline glittering with lights. Inside, guests moved through the space dressed in elegant attire, sipping champagne, engaged in effortless conversations. Tristan met her at the entrance, his presence grounding. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his gaze made her breath hitch. You look beautiful, he said, not as a compliment but as a fact. She wasn't sure why that meant more than it should. A live band played in the corner, and as the night progressed, Ava found herself on stage in front of an audience unlike any she'd performed for before. These weren't just casual listeners. They were people who made decisions, who could change lives with a single nod. She took a breath, then another, and she sang. As the final note faded, the applause was immediate and genuine. People approached her afterward, handing her business cards, asking about future performances. It was more attention than she was used to, but through it all, her eyes kept finding Tristan's across the room. Later, when the party had thinned and the city stretched endlessly outside the windows, he found her standing near the balcony, looking out at the skyline. You did more than just impress them, Tristan said, coming to stand beside her. Ava exhaled, her fingers gripping the railing. It doesn't feel real. He turned toward her, his voice quieter now. It is. She met his gaze and for the first time, let herself really see him not just as the man who had walked into her jazz club weeks ago, but as someone who had gone out of his way to believe in her. You never told me, she said. Why did you do all this? Tristan didn't look away. Because I heard you sing, and I knew the world needed to hear you too. Something inside her shifted. Without thinking, she leaned in. And this time, Tristan met her halfway. Ava hadn't meant for it to happen. One moment, she was standing on the balcony, the night air cool against her skin, the city stretching before her like a dream she had never dared to believe in. The next, she was kissing Tristan Mercer, and he kissed her back. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. His hand found her waist, steadying her, anchoring her in the moment. His lips moved against hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, a slow unraveling of every carefully guarded piece of herself. When they finally pulled away, he didn't step back. Neither did she. For a beat, silence stretched between them, the hum of the party behind them a distant murmur. Ava's breath was unsteady as she searched his face, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That probably wasn't a good idea. Tristan's gaze didn't waver. It felt like a great idea. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You don't seem like the kind of man who does things impulsively. I'm not. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that sent a rush of warmth through her. But I'm also not the kind of man who ignores what he wants. Ava swallowed hard, her pulse still racing. And what do you want? He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter, more certain. You. Her heart stuttered. Tristan Mercer was the kind of man who existed in a different world, a world of power and influence, where people listened when he spoke and doors opened simply because he stood in front of them. She was just a singer in a jazz club. And yet, when he looked at her like that, none of it seemed to matter. Ava exhaled, forcing herself to step back, to create distance before she lost herself completely. "I don't think this is a good idea," she said, though the words tasted wrong the moment they left her lips. Tristan's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because whatever this is, it's happening too fast. And because I don't know anything about you." His jaw tightened slightly. For the first time, she realized how little she did know. Tristan had been showing up at the club, helping her in ways she hadn't expected, but he had never once talked about himself. She didn't even know what he did for a living. "I'll take you home," he said, his voice measured. Ava nodded, grateful that he didn't push. The car ride was quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable but carried weight nonetheless. The city passed in a blur of headlights and neon signs, but Ava barely noticed. When they pulled up in front of her apartment, she turned to him, searching for words that didn't feel inadequate. "Thank you for everything tonight." His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel. "I meant what I said, Ava. I don't do things without thinking them through." She met his gaze, something in her chest tightening. "I know." For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, but then he nodded. "Good night, Ava." She hesitated, then slipped out of the car, closing the door behind her. As she walked up the steps to her building, she could still feel the warmth of his touch, the ghost of his lips against hers. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she was running towards something or away from it. The next few days passed in a haze of rehearsals, meetings, and quiet moments where Ava found herself thinking about Tristan more than she should. She hadn't seen him since the night of the party, but he was everywhere in her thoughts, in the way her fingers lingered over her phone, in the way she caught herself searching for him in crowds. It was ridiculous. She barely knew him. And yet, when she stepped into the jazz club on Friday night, she wasn't surprised to find him there. This time, he wasn't at the bar. He was seated at a table near the stage, his gaze already on her. Ava's breath hitched, but she pushed aside whatever was stirring in her chest and took the stage. She didn't know what possessed her to do it, but when she sang, she let herself sing to him. The lyrics wrapped around her like a confession, and as Tristan watched her, his expression unreadable, she knew that whatever this was between them wasn't something she could ignore. When the song ended, she stepped away from the microphone, her pulse thrumming as she made her way toward him. Tristan stood as she approached, his hands sliding into his pockets. "You were incredible." Ava crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Are you going to tell me who you really are?" Something flickered in his gaze, but he didn't look away. "What do you want to know?" She arched a brow. "Let's start with what you actually do for a living." Tristan exhaled, glancing around before motioning toward the door. "Come with me." She hesitated, but then curiosity won over. Outside, the night air was crisp, and the city hummed around them. Tristan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I run a company," he said. "Several, actually." Ava frowned. "What kind of company?" "Finance. Investments. Real estate." He paused. "I'm a millionaire, Ava." The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Ava blinked, caught off guard. She had known he wasn't just some ordinary guy, but she hadn't expected this. She took a slow breath, letting it sink in. "And you didn't think to mention that earlier?" Tristan's lips pressed together. Would it have changed anything? She wanted to say yes, but the truth was it wouldn't have. Ava shook her head, a slow smile tugging at her lips. "You really have been slumming it in my little jazz club, haven't you?" Something in Tristan's posture eased. "I wouldn't call it that. I'd call it finally being where I want to be." Her heart stuttered. She didn't know what to say to that. So instead, she did the only thing that made sense. She kissed him. Ava hadn't planned on falling. She had spent so much of her life guarding herself against disappointment, keeping her dreams tucked away where they couldn't be shattered. But somehow Tristan had slipped past her defenses, weaving himself into the spaces she had kept closed off for so long. And now she was standing in his penthouse, the city stretching beneath them like a sea of endless lights, her heart hammering in her chest. The kiss they'd shared outside the jazz club had changed everything. She had expected hesitation, second-guessing, maybe even regret. But instead, Tristan had taken her hand, brought her here, and shown her a world that was so undeniably his. The penthouse was sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. But it wasn't the space itself that left her breathless. It was the way Tristan moved through it effortlessly, like a man who had built his empire with his own two hands and had never once doubted his place in it. But he wasn't just a man of wealth. He was a man of intent. And right now, his intent was completely focused on her. Tristan poured them each a glass of wine, his movements slow, deliberate. He handed her one, his fingers brushing against hers for just a second longer than necessary. The air crackled with something unspoken. Ava took a slow sip, watching him over the rim of her glass. "So, this is where you disappear to after my performances." Tristan leaned against the counter, his gaze locked onto hers. "Sometimes, other times, I find myself thinking about you more than I should." Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to play it cool. "And what exactly do you think about?" He took a measured sip of his own drink before setting the glass down. "The way you get lost in your music. The way you hold yourself like you don't realize just how much power you have in a room." His voice dropped slightly. "The way you looked at me before you kissed me." Ava's breath caught. He wasn't playing games. He never had been. She set her glass down beside his, closing the space between them. "And now that I've kissed you?" Tristan reached for her, his fingers brushing along the curve of her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. "Now, I don't think I can stop." Her pulse pounded as he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, like he was savoring every second. Ava melted into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. Tristan wasn't gentle, but he wasn't rushed either. He kissed like a man who knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't afraid to take it. And right now, he wanted her. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling. Ava exhaled a soft laugh. "I should probably be more cautious about this." Tristan's lips curved slightly. "Do you want to be?" She thought about it. Thought about all the reasons she should be hesitant, the differences between them, the way he had slipped into her life so effortlessly. Then, she shook her head. "No." Tristan's hand slid down her arm, his fingers lacing through hers. "Then don't be." And just like that, she stopped thinking. She let herself fall. Ava had always believed that happiness was fleeting. But as the weeks passed, she found herself waking up in Tristan's bed, wrapped in his warmth, tangled in sheets that felt like luxury against her skin. Their worlds began to intertwine in ways she hadn't expected. Tristan wasn't just a man of wealth. He was a man of precision. He found ways to bring her into his life without overwhelming her. He never flaunted his wealth in a way that made her feel small. Instead, he used it to pull her closer, to take her to quiet, hidden restaurants where no one knew their names, to reserve late-night studio time so she could record without distractions, to ensure that every door she had once struggled to open was now unlocked. But he never forced her through them. He simply stood beside her, waiting, and Ava realized, slowly but surely, that this wasn't just passion. This was something more, something terrifyingly real. It wasn't until one evening, when she came home to find Tristan waiting for her with an unusual look in his eyes, that she realized just how much had changed. She set her bag down, kicking off her heels. "You're home early." Tristan crossed the room, his movements measured. "I needed to see you." Ava frowned slightly. "Is everything okay?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her breath caught. Tristan didn't drop to one knee. He didn't make a grand speech. Instead, he simply opened the box, revealing the most breathtaking ring she had ever seen. "I love you," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I don't want to spend another day without knowing that you're mine." Ava's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. "Tristan, no second guessing," he cut in. "No hesitations. I know who I am and I know who you are. And I know that whatever this is between us, it's the only thing I've ever been sure of." Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. She could have questioned it, could have asked if they were moving too fast. But the truth was, she had known from the moment she met him. This man was hers, and she was his. Ava reached for him, her fingers trembling as she took the ring from the box and slid it onto her own finger. Tristan let out a breath, his hands coming up to cup her face as he kissed her this time, not with urgency, but with certainty. She pulled back just enough to whisper against his lips, yes. Their wedding was small, intimate. A ceremony tucked away in a vineyard just outside the city where the only thing that mattered was the vows they exchanged beneath the setting sun. Ava stood in a dress that shimmered like stardust, her fingers laced with Tristan's as he promised her forever. And when he kissed her, the world faded. There was no past. No hesitations. No fears. Only them. Only love. And as the music played and the night stretched on, Ava realized. She hadn't just fallen. She had found her home.